Hello, this is Liana Andreasen from the English department, and I will be talking about the Enlightenment today. And before I start my PowerPoint, I just want to say a couple words about why is the Enlightenment important? Why do we still talk about it today? It's an 18th century movement. So, well, it is important because there are times in history that are that change everything. So this is one of them. If you think about the Renaissance, which came after centuries of dogma and very restrictive type of mentality and thinking, this is similar in that respect. It started to change the focus from something more traditional, more dogmatic, to human thought, human creativity, and especially to the powers of the human mind and reason. And of course, it's not the last one, even if it's in the 18th century, we have such movements more recently. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, we had the liberation movements, the civil rights movement. So even today, we talk about being woke, which in a way it's another way to say we are trying to find new ways of thinking. We are trying to challenge old ways of thinking, and it's another way to change mentality and try to see the world differently. So the Enlightenment was, of course, much more extended as a time period or as a movement. It started toward the end of the 17th century and it lasted till the beginning of the 19th century. So that's why we call it the long 18th century. So let me put my PowerPoint on and then I'll talk about the details of it and why it had such a big impact. Share screen. So let me disappear. And this is the front page. Let me put it as a slideshow. Okay, so what is the Enlightenment? Just a definition, the Enlightenment is the name we give today. We started in the 19th century to call it the Enlightenment, to the seismic shift in human thought that took place in European and in American cultures in the late 17th century up until the beginning of the 19th century, with a renewed focus on a universal humanity following Renaissance humanism. It is a philosophical, political, scientific, and artistic movement, also called the Age of Reason. Some people consider it the beginning of modernity. What happened within this long 18th century was that centuries of traditionalist thinking, such as superstitious, dogmatic, classist mentalities, which characterize monarchical societies, were challenged at their very core. The scientific revolution and the print culture brought new ways of investigating the world, giving more access to knowledge. And secondly, the spreading of revolutionary ideals, such as the talk of rights, equality, democracy, reason, and a more personal approach to faith, along with the rejection of the church and the rise of deism, pantheism, atheism, and other approaches. These all, of course, were very expansive and took over pretty much all the aspects of society and human endeavor. Today, the Enlightenment is seen with a more critical eye, as it was also the age of colonialism and the beginning of modern day racism. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. We still look at the Enlightenment as profoundly influential and basically revolutionizing the way we think. And also it was the beginning of how we think of racism today, because there was still too much emphasis on superiority of a certain race. So move on and talk about the early influences of the Enlightenment. And I put here one kind of buzzword at the time, the social contract, a visual of that, which some of the thinkers of that time period were talking a lot about. So Benedict de Spinoza was a Dutch Jewish philosopher who was a proponent of freedom of thought and of belief, and of seeing God everywhere in nature. So he was a pantheist. He is one of the early theorists of determinism, which means that everything necessarily happens the way it does. John Locke, another philosopher, another figure of great influence, was mostly a philosopher, but also a physicist and revolutionary in the English Civil War. And by the way, the English Civil War was one of the one of the events that triggered such shifts in human thought. So he introduced the ideas of democratic government, tolerance, and equality according to the laws of God and nature. Ideas of natural rights took off after him and inspired the philosophers of the Enlightenment, as well as the American and English revolutions. So the Enlightenment actually was the philosophical foundation to the English and American Revolution. Of great influence was also the philosopher René Descartes, who introduced the notion of skepticism as essential to the scientific method. Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher known for the book Leviathan, and his formulation of the theory of the social contract, claimed human tendencies to fight wars can be countered by strong government. So these are early influences. The Enlightenment is also called the Age of Reason because at that time there was a fascination with science, with reason, science, mathematics, philosophy, spurred by the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century. So you will see that a lot of these figures, these important people of the Enlightenment, were they research in many different fields. They were philosophers, they were scientists, writers, even of literature. So starting with one of the figures of greatest influence, Galileo Galilei, on my right here in the slide. He introduced the telescope and the study of the motion of stars and planets following Copernicus of the Renaissance, who had claimed the planets were revolving around the sun, not the other way around, because it was believed before him that everything revolved around the Earth. So this is the heliocentric universe as we know it today. Well, partially. We still are exploring, right? Isaac Newton and his findings in physics, mathematics, chemistry, and astronomy. He also perfected a telescope. He's known for his study of light and the components of light and the laws of motion and the law of gravity. Johannes Kepler, a German scientist, developed the scientific method and studied the planet's elliptical motion. And also he studied the eyes of different species, including the human eye, and he observed the first supernova, which was named after him. Gottfried Leibniz, a German philosopher and mathematician, invented the mechanical calculator and laid the foundation of binary numbers that later helped develop the computer. He was notable for the philosophy of optimism, which means everything happens for a good reason. It's part of God's plan. And this is what later Voltaire mocked in his writings. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very important figure, influenced the American Revolution in particular. He was a Swiss and French philosopher, and he may be the most influential thinker of the European Enlightenment. He proposed several popular ideas: that people are naturally good, but society corrupts them, that creativity is more important than formal rules, especially in art, that the purpose of civil society and the social contract is to ensure the right to property and to provide peace to everyone. He also introduced the notion of civil rights, and these are a couple of his major works: Discourse on the Origin of Inequality and the Social Contract. Jonathan Swift, this is one of the figures who is remembered more for his literary works, but he was also interested in many other things. One of the figures most associated with the Enlightenment is Jonathan Swift, an English-Irish writer who's considered to this day among the most influential satirists in history. He was also a poet, novelist, essayist, cleric, and politician. His satire was directed towards social issues plaguing society at the time, such as poverty, the oppression of the Irish, the wars between Catholics and Protestants, and even monarchy. He was a prolific writer, found in many anthologies and textbooks today. The Modest Proposal, which you may have read, is a mock argument about eating babies, still widely taught around the world as an example of rhetorical tools used to shock politicians into action. And Gulliver's Travels considered his masterpiece, is a tale of a sailor who travels to a world of tiny people called Lilliput, a world of giants called Brobdingnag, a floating island of philosophers called Laputa, and a land of intelligent horses called Houyhnhnms. And this is his most well-known text, in which he notoriously attacks both monarchy, in particular Henry VIII, for their shallowness and obsession with power, and also he exposed many flaws in human nature, such as greed, superficiality, pompousness, religious fanaticism, and intolerance. And kind of, well, I don't want to call him apprentice, but influenced by Swift in some ways. Voltaire, he was born a French aristocrat, and his biggest ambition was to become a writer against his father's wishes. And he moved to London, and he was introduced to English philosophy, to Jonathan Swift's satire, and to Newton's writings, which he later translated. So he brought all this back with him when he returned to Paris to become a prolific and controversial writer, producing masterful satirical plays, a scandalous book of philosophical letters, and most importantly, his cultural and political critiques that are now associated with the Enlightenment. Along with Diderot and D'Alembert, he created a controversial encyclopedia, and he also published Candide, which is a picaresque novel or Bildungsroman novel full of fast-paced adventure, but also harsh satire. He also published many essays and treatises. He was banned, imprisoned. He worked briefly as a spy. He wrote under over 100 pseudonyms. And his biggest contribution is a challenge to all authority and any form of tyranny or cruelty, and the belief in the power of reason and progress. Thomas Jefferson, moving now to Americans, Thomas Jefferson was the main author of the Declaration of Independence and an advocate of religious freedom and equality, except that sadly that didn't apply to his views on slavery. A scientist, philosopher, and a president, Jefferson was also a liaison between Americans and the French, whose ideas strongly influenced him. Some of his ideas were controversial, such as assimilationist policy toward Native Americans. He's credited with the idea that there should be a wall of separation between church and state, especially given that he rejected organized religion and had affinities with deism, which claimed that truth, including God and nature, can only be achieved by reason, not divine revelation. Another American, Benjamin Franklin, and I put here a picture showing him with his kite when he experimented with lightning to research electricity. Not only was Ben Franklin one of the founders of the United States and engineers of the Independence War, obtaining the help of France and working tirelessly for the goal of independence, but he was also an inventor, printer, and a publisher, a researcher in electricity, etc. Fully embracing the philosophy of the Enlightenment, especially Leibniz, he rejected traditional religion, promoted science, reason, human rights, free thinking, access to education, and he generally believed progress can be achieved through learning. Now, moving just a few notes on the literature of the Enlightenment, since I'm with the English department. Being fond of rationalism, writers of the Enlightenment gravitated toward classicism, which is, it's a type of writing that is fond of patterns, rules, norms. So their works were striving for structure, unity, harmony, and clarity. Drama flourished in France in particular with Molière, known for his satire. In England, a very influential work was John Milton's Paradise Lost, an account of Satan's revenge plan to corrupt humanity after banishment from paradise. It is considered the greatest English epic poem. Though he meant to justify the ways of God to men, he kind of inadvertently, or maybe it was on purpose, but it's not known, it's controversial to this day. His story made Satan, as the original rebel, the most inspiring character in the book by humanizing him and endowing him with democratic ideals, such as, well, Satan creates a democracy in hell where he has the other fallen angels vote for what to do and how to organize themselves. Well, he became a big influence to the Romantics, who were rebellious thinkers and writers. The rise of the novel in Europe, this literary genre was taking shape with names such as Henry Fielding, Goethe and Jonathan Swift, whose Gulliver's Travels is considered by some the first literary novel. Satire was quite popular as a main way to attack indirectly the authority of the church and of the government, especially of the monarchy, and the most known satirists of the time was Swift and Voltaire. And now the last slide shows two sides of the legacy of the Enlightenment. On the one hand, we have the critics of the Enlightenment, starting with the Romantics who came right after it. So the obsession with reason, order, and with quantifying and classifying all reality led to an opposite movement in the 18th and 19th century, known as Romanticism, with a focus on human creativity. The Romantics emphasized emotion and imagination rather than reason, subjective individuality rather than logical thought, mystery rather than objective knowledge. Romanticism gave us Shelley, Byron, Blake in England, Théophile Gautier in France, Pushkin, Lermontov in Russia, Hawthorne and Poe in the US, and many others. Thinkers such as Nietzsche, Heidegger, and more recently Foucault, Deleuze, etc., critiqued the Enlightenment for its Western bias and its worship of science and technology to the detriment of human diversity and emotion. Social norms and universal ideals and values were often shown to be restrictive and racist, having the tendency to suppress otherness and plurality. So there was an emphasis, especially thinking of colonialism, to put the white so-called race on top, considering white people superior to all other races. So this is one of the main criticisms of the Enlightenment. But there is also a positive legacy. So we still need science, we still need rational thinking. So there are still ideas from the Enlightenment that are needed today. The optimism of the age, the belief in the possibility of progress through science and rationality, as well as the human rights advocacy, these are all to this day a way to fight against superstition, dogmatism, and totalitarianism, against intolerance, misinformation, and even conspiracy theories. So religious beliefs and traditions can still be used as a weapon against individual freedom, and it is still necessary to prevent belief from determining governance and law. Many forces are at work today, and they can bring medieval darkness back, sadly, complete with a plague. We can only hope enlightened minds prevail. And this is the end of the presentation. And I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something from it. And hopefully it's not just the English department that can make use of this presentation, but thank you for listening. Bye.